Well, happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this special video edition of Fried Okra, the public education podcast for Oklahomans. I'm Carrie Coppernall Jacobs of the Oklahoma Education Association.
And I'm Alicia Priest, president of the OEA. Fried Okra is a weekly podcast where we get together to talk about public education issues in Oklahoma. We hope you will join us every Friday.
And we are so excited today to have a special guest with us. We've got Quraysh Ali Lansana, who is a poet, author, and educator. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, we wanted to visit with you about your book, Opal's Greenwood Oasis, which I brought our copy from home, is a great story about a third grader and her bicycle, and sort of opens the door to have a conversation about what happened in Greenwood in 1921. So can you kind of give us a look into the genesis for this book? Where and why did you decide to do this project?
Sure. So I've been back in Oklahoma for about 2.5 years. I spent 29 in Chicago and 2 in New York for graduate school. But I've been researching the Greenwood District and the massacre for almost 20 years. And as an educator and as a parent, and as an Oklahoman, right, I wanted to make sure that our young people have found a way into this history, and that we provided a way for young people to access this history that was both celebrating Black excellence over Black pain, and because certainly the massacre was one of the most, if not the worst, act of racial violence in the history of this country. But thinking about what was destroyed. And what was destroyed was the Greenwood District, which at one time from 1905 to 1921 was the most affluent Black community in the country. And it's completely self-sufficient, completely independent, of course, because it had to be because of the Jim Crow laws in the state and in Tulsa, but was economically vibrant with schools, banks, hospitals, theaters, churches. And certainly it had an aspect of there was always a criminal aspect to it, just like there is in any community. There's danger, but it was for the most part an exceedingly safe environment, and self-sufficient and self-sustaining. And so it was important to me, one, because all of us as Oklahomans were never taught this history in K-12 education. It was not taught in Oklahoma history class in 8th grade, 9th grade. So, the history of what happened was buried, by design, by the state, by the city. For almost a century, right? But also because of that, and then also thinking about how if young people growing up in Greenwood or North Tulsa today, or the South Side of Chicago where I lived for so long, or different parts, different communities, that if they step out their door, right, and what they see is what they know. Right. And so if you're in the Northeast Oklahoma City and you step out your door, sometimes I believe that our young people see that, and that's as far as they can go. Right. If you can't see beyond, right, your immediate reality, then your dreams will stay, unless you have adults, teachers, parents, others who are helping you see and dream beyond your block, beyond your immediate situation. Then our children's often, because life is hard, particularly in marginalized communities, their dreams can be stunted before they even have a chance to grow, chance to blossom. So part of the work of this book is helping young folks in North Tulsa and places like North Tulsa, like Northeast Oklahoma City, like Southside, Westside Chicago, see a world that was created, right? A community that was created by Black hands, right? That thrived. That was economically vibrant and independent for the most part of South Tulsa. And I wanted young people to really see that Black folks built this place, and that it's in your DNA to do the same.
One of the things that I love about it is, let me find an example here. So is the way that you drop in names and locations that really honor that this is not fiction, that this is a real place with real families and real businesses, and the way that you sort of drop in, the drugstore, Williams Drugstore, and different businesses along the way. Why was that important to do that specifically?
Well, one, to honor what was, right? To honor that these are the folks who built these businesses, built these homes. And secondly, as I think you really sort of spoke to, Carrie, in your question, that it was a real place, that this place really existed. The only fictional characters are Opal and her family, right? Yeah. Everyone else who's referenced in the book, every place that's referenced in the book actually existed in Greenwood. And it was important, again, to honor the history, to honor what was here and who built what was here. And I say here because I'm literally on Greenwood Avenue right now in my office at OSU Tulsa. Yeah. And to honor and to give them names, to give them, to sort of lift them up, right? You know, folks are alive for as long as we remember them. And, there are plaques on Greenwood Avenue that in the places where these businesses once existed. That's a form of remembrance as well. So this is another way to call their names and to honor what they did and that they lost their lives. Many folks lost their lives. Certainly lost their homes and their businesses, because of economic jealousy and racism. I mean, period. So it was important, again, to identify who was there and to go on this bike ride with Opal through this community so we could show off what it was.
And so speaking of the bike ride, that's another thing that I really enjoy about the book is that it is sort of the opposite of the specific, and that it is so universal, that this is accessible to no matter where you grew up. Kids can identify with Opal riding her bike for the first time, to the store by herself. That is a sort of this childhood rite of passage. I think it really gives a humanity of this is everyday America. That makes it, it takes place in Greenwood, but that is any neighborhood, you know?
And thank you for saying that, because that was certainly a point of the bike ride, right? Is that, as you said, it's a universal rite of passage when your parents allow you to go on your first bike ride by yourself, right? Yeah. And that that Opal takes us with her. Through this vibrant community where, Mrs. Little knows her and Mr. Man who owns the grocery store, they know her family and they're concerned, what you doing out here without your parents, right? There's this, it's community. And to give that sense of community and that sense of safety was very important. But also, again, the bike ride is a way for any child and an adult, for that matter, to sort of enter the story. Yeah. And I'm glad you picked that up.
Yeah. So I am a Spanish teacher, and it's so important for me to introduce culturally appropriate, historically accurate information to my students, and to have them be able to connect in ways that Carrie and I did with Opal's Greenwood. Anyway, what do you hope comes from sharing this story of Opal's Greenwood Oasis?
Well, number one, I hope that we are introducing again, or sort of reintroducing this district, what it was before it was destroyed. That, again, I lean on the idea of Black excellence over Black pain, to introduce to our young people that this thriving community was built by Black hands, that $1 could start at the corner of Greenwood at Archer at sunrise and travel all the way up to Pine and back to the same spot at sunset, and have exchanged hands 18 times and nothing but Black hands, right? And the money staying in the community. So I wanted to make sure that we, again, honor and help young people remember that this place really existed, that it's not a myth. It was real, right? That's one. Secondly, again, as I mentioned earlier, to help our young people see the past so they can take stock in the present and then maybe build or dream a future, right? That this place was built by Black hands. It's in our DNA. It's in your DNA to see and build and dream beyond your immediate situations, your immediate surroundings. That's two. Three, I wanted to provide, I should say, with Naja Amatullah Hilton and Skip Hill, our illustrator, our amazing illustrator, we wanted to provide sort of some jumping off points for teachers and adults to, if they wanted to discuss what happened the next day after Opal's ride, then they could guide that conversation or those conversations as they so chose, right? Again, thinking about, as an educator, that, as I don't know that I feel like a third, fourth grader, most third, fourth graders could handle, the catastrophe of the massacre. I'm not sure they're ready for that yet. Yeah. As a journalist, I often ponder, right? We can't, how do we talk to our kids about the pandemic, right? Sure. They're in it. They lived it. Right? How do we talk to our young people, our children, about difficult topics? When are they old enough to understand or be able to ascertain or comprehend without fear? Right? Yeah. And again, we are in a prime example of this. How do you talk to young people about this pandemic? You see that people are dying. Maybe people have died in your family. People are getting sick. You can't go to school. Yeah. Right? How do you navigate conversations with an 8-year-old, 9-year-old? About what this situation is. And so we wanted to make sure that we presented what was in a way that also, again, allowed adults, allowed teachers, allowed parents to take a child by the hand and say, okay, I want to walk you through this, but I'm going to walk you through this in a way in which I feel like you are capable of handling it, of ascertaining what is here or not. Right. And so that's why we end the book where we do at Memorial Day or Decoration Day, it was called then, at the picnic, and Opal receiving her reward and then the photo of the devastation of the next day. So but wanting to help young people, again, understand that particularly young people in North Tulsa who haven't experienced, it's a food desert, Northeast Oklahoma City is a food desert. Yeah. So having young people who haven't experienced anything but that kind of hardship, right? The mortality rate in North Tulsa is 11 years less than the mortality rate in South Tulsa, right? Yeah. And that's going up and down Peoria about 5 miles, right? Yeah. So to be able to help our young people in North Tulsa and everywhere, right, really find a way to enter this history. In addition to that, it's also a book, as I often quote Clara Luper. And Miss Luper, in 2016, she said, my biggest job now is helping white people understand that Black history is white history. We cannot separate the two. Right. Yeah. And so that's a part of this as well. Right. Is that it's a way to introduce this story to young white folks, too, and folks and children of all ethnicities as well, and say, look, this is what happened. Yep. Because of systemic racism. This is what happened because of economic jealousy. Right. This is not something that you want to perpetuate, but see it, right. Look at it. This is real. This is what was destroyed. This little go ahead.
And what we're living now is a culmination of denying those parts of our history that deal with racism and systemic racism and the white supremacy culture. And so it's created a bigger issue because we have not wanted to deal with it in history. And one of the things that I wrote down was we shouldn't be waiting until high school to teach history and to teach Greenwood and what happened. And your book is a beautiful example of how we can start that in earlier grades so that our students can see themselves in the books.
Right.
And so that they can begin to learn the lessons in a way that they can understand.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, and you both are acutely aware that there are more animals as lead characters in children's books than there are children of color. I mean, and we're in 2021, and that's still the truth. That's still what is, and that's horrible. That's horrific. But it's also by design as well. It is not by accident. And then to further what you just said, Alicia, this House Bill 1775 is just toxic and dangerous, and is a perpetuation of what you just said. It's a perpetuation of a denial of the inclusivity of real life and real history, right? I often say until African American studies is not an elective but a requirement, until Indigenous American studies is not an elective but a requirement, until Latinx studies are not an elective but a requirement, then we will all be indoctrinated by the same lens, by one vantage point, by one gaze.
And when we talk about history, and this year is the 100th anniversary, as everybody's aware, that is not that long ago. I mean, that's not 500 years ago. That is a few generations ago. That's for right. For our current students. There are people in Tulsa who are descendants of this. This is not that they can directly, easily trace back. This is not this happened off in ancient Egypt. This is right, very close to where we are right now.
Right here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. It's very alive. And one of the things that I often, when I'm engaging in teaching or conducting what are called racial healing circles, I ask folks, do you believe that there's a stigma that exists about North Tulsa? And most folks say yes. North Tulsa is primarily, a Black community. And then I ask them, what are the stigmas that you think people carry about North Tulsa? And folks say crime and racism and, poverty and so on and so forth. And then I asked them, I said, so do you understand, right, that the same stigma, right, that there's stigmas that you are telling me exist today, understand that those stigmas are over 100 years old. They're very alive. The only difference between those stigmas in 1921 and those stigmas in 2021 is that in 1921, the community was actually affluent and thriving, right? And could take care of itself and its children, right? Because there were banks and shops and homes and theaters and churches and grocery stores. And now it's a food desert, right? But the same stigmas apply. Kids on the South Side, and I taught at a school on the South Side when I first got to Tulsa, their parents tell them not to go to the North Side, because it's a scary place to be, So, yeah, Tulsa remains exceedingly segregated, very, very segregated. And the really telling part about all of it, I think for me, again, having been back in Oklahoma for 2.5 years and in Tulsa for all of those, those 2.5 years, is to be reminded of the pervasiveness of racism in Oklahoma, and how it's just in so many ways a part of the water. I often say I've met some of the nicest racists here, because there's some really, good people, not necessarily good people, but nice people, friendly people, but just racist, and that we live in a state where it's still possible to not interact with a person of color, you know? And I just came from the south side of Chicago, where I could possibly go through days and weeks and not interact with someone who was not of color, you know? And I think both of those things are not necessarily healthy, right? Because that's not the real world, right? That's not what's real. What's real is that we're all here and in this together. And that is why 17 House Bill 7075 is so dangerous, because it only represents a singular viewpoint, which we've all already been indoctrinated with anyway, you know? So, but don't get me started on that. Go ahead.
So I'm going to circle back, ever the teacher. What message do you want to give to educators who are sharing the story of Opal's Greenwood Oasis with their students?
One, again, that this place really existed, and it's worthy of study. It's worthy of a deeper study, even in terms of taking a look at old maps and photos before the massacre, to see the kind of vibrant life that existed in the district. Two, that Opal, as you've already, I think, mentioned, Alicia, Opal it's a universal story in terms of the bike ride that everyone, I think, can connect to, can relate to. Three, again, we chose very deliberately to have a girl forward focus because of that lack of characters of color in children's books. Also, again, that to reinforce the idea of community, right? And I think that gets lost sometimes when we're thinking about communities of color. That there was community, there was safety, people knew one another, people looked out for one another. Also, again, those sort of jumping off points that teachers can lead students on their own pace, at their own pace, on a walk through what happens the next day. And, I want teachers to fall in love with the images. I think Skip's illustrations are magnificent.
They're beautiful. I love them.
And to be able to I think to show those images, to be able to display and help young people gain a deeper sense of life, that even in the face of Jim Crow, that young people grew up and had a childhood. And, I don't know that our young people have childhoods anymore, but that these kids had a childhood. And they went to church, they went to school, they rode bicycles on Saturdays, they went down to Williams Confectionery and got milkshakes. And that we actually can't even do those things anymore. How much that kind of community exists in very few places, in 2021.
I will say I just came up with 15 cross-curricular lesson plans in my head as you were talking.
Yeah, so. Good. Yeah, well, good. Maybe you can share some with me. We are working on, with the Greenwood Cultural Center, we are working on developing a curriculum for essentially 3rd through 5th graders, which I need to get back to. But yeah, I think there's place, there's location, there's the history of the time. There's thinking about the fact that, that this was just after the end of World War I, the first time the Black men could fight on behalf of the country. There are many historical intersections there that can be explored. The state was still young. The fact that Greenwood is actually where the Osage, a cattle reservation, Muskogee Creek land, and Cherokee land intersect and meet. And then it became, and then it became, Greenwood, because O.W. Gurley bought the first plot at 101 North Greenwood Avenue, and then set up shop. But there's an interesting debate about about if it was Creek land first or Caddo or Osage or whatnot. But in fact, it was all at one point in time. It's actually a place where all of those lands meet. And then you have the Greenwood District, right there as well. So there's a lot of history. There's a lot of blood on this soil. There's a lot of history, a lot of spirits on this land as well. And then I think about, again, that Black folks could not go south of 1st Street or 2nd Street unless they had a white escort, which was, working as a domestic in someone's home. That Black folks were interned in 3 different locations for up to 6 days, unless a white person came and vouched for you, came and claimed their Negro, is the phrase. And so there's a lot of stuff to teach in the book, that we sort of hint at. Some things we dig deep in, drill down on, but there are a lot of sort of jumping off places.
Well, if I encourage everybody, I've got a 5th grader and a kindergartner, and I encourage parents of young kids to get this book and read it to them. I think it opens the door to have lots of conversations in lots of ways. But also, I would encourage educators to request it at your school library.
Please.
Absolutely.
That have it there accessible for everybody. So we deeply appreciate your time. We know that you are busy beyond measure, so we appreciate you so much, Quraysh, for coming and visiting with us and for your work on this book. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. And, my co-author and I and our illustrator, Skip, we also make house calls. So if any schools or teachers are out there,
yes,
administrators are interested in having us do a virtual event or an in-person event, if you're feeling comfortable, we're open to that as well. And you can contact us through our publisher, which is the Calliope Group, LLC.
Awesome. That is great.